Vienna, 1938. Professor Heinrich Mannheim. The name has been changed, but the story is documented. Held the most prestigious academic chair in economics at the University of Vienna. 30 years of published research. A waiting list of students from across Europe. Letters of introduction that opened every door in the continent's financial establishment. He also held a significant position in Austrian government bonds. A portfolio of Viennese commercial real estate. A network of banking relationships built across 3 decades of professional respectability. Within 18 months, every one of those assets had lost all meaningful value. Not depreciated, not declined, erased. The bonds defaulted when the political architecture that backed them ceased to exist. The commercial real estate, valuable precisely because of its location in the commercial heart of a prosperous European capital, became worthless when the foot traffic that had made it valuable was replaced by military occupation. The banking relationships evaporated when the banks were reorganized under new political authority. The academic chair was revoked, and the prestige, the 30 years of accumulated professional reputation, the letters of introduction, the institutional standing, gone. Not because his knowledge had diminished, not because his research had been proven wrong, because the institutional system that converted his reputation into practical value had been replaced by a different system with entirely different rules for what it valued. Professor Mannheim had spent 30 years building a portfolio of assets. Every single one of them shared a single fatal flaw he had never considered. They all required the same specific institutional environment to retain their value. When that environment changed, they did not merely depreciate, they ceased to function as assets at all. This is the pattern that every serious examination of economic collapse produces. And it is the pattern that almost no financial advice addresses, because financial advice is itself an institutional product, designed for institutional conditions, and therefore constitutionally incapable of questioning its own foundations. The 5 assets we are about to examine are not obscure. They are not exotic instruments that only sophisticated investors hold. They are the most commonly held, most universally recommended, most thoroughly normalized forms of wealth in the modern economy. Every financial advisor recommends them. Every retirement planner builds around them. Every conventional wisdom about prudent wealth management includes them as foundations. They are also with remarkable consistency across every economic collapse in the historical record. Among the first things to lose all value when the institutional environment that gives them meaning stops functioning. Understanding why requires understanding something that most financial education never addresses: the difference between an asset and an institutional claim. An asset has value independent of the institutional environment. A piece of land grows food regardless of which government claims sovereignty over it. A skilled craftsman's capability exists regardless of whether any credential board has certified it. A stockpile of seeds retains its potential regardless of what currency is currently accepted in the local market. An institutional claim has value only as long as the institution that backs it continues to function, continues to be trusted, and continues to operate within a system that recognizes its authority. Most of what passes for wealth in modern economies is institutional claims, not assets. The distinction is invisible in stable conditions. It becomes catastrophically visible in collapse. Warsaw, 1939, September. A city that had been one of Europe's most sophisticated capitals was reorganized within weeks under military occupation. The entire institutional architecture of Polish professional and social life, the courts, the universities, the professional associations, the banking system, the commercial networks that had made Warsaw function, was either dismantled or repurposed under new authority. In that reorganization, something happened that economic historians have documented with painful precision across dozens of similar events. The value of social status, of institutional rank, professional title, organizational affiliation dropped to zero with a speed that shocked even the people experiencing it. A senior judge whose authority had commanded absolute deference in the previous system had no authority in the new one. A professor whose academic rank had provided a comfortable living found the rank meant nothing to the new institutional order. A business owner whose community standing had been the foundation of his credit relationships discovered that the community relationships that had backed his credit no longer functioned as collateral. The status was real, the rank was earned. The standing had been built over decades of genuine achievement within a genuine system. None of that mattered, because status, rank, and standing are not properties of the person who holds them. They are properties of the system that recognizes them. When the system changes, the status does not transfer, it evaporates. This is not limited to military occupation. Economic collapse produces the same mechanism through purely financial means. Argentina, 2001, December. The Argentine financial crisis reorganized the country's economic hierarchy with a speed that observers found almost as shocking as the financial losses themselves. The middle-class professionals who had built their economic identity around their institutional position, their credit rating, their bank relationships, their professional status in formal employment, found that the institutional collapse had not simply reduced their wealth, it had erased the institutional identity through which their wealth had operated. Senior bank manager whose professional standing had provided access to credit, to networks, to the social infrastructure of the Argentine upper middle class, discovered that when the banks froze and the formal financial system suspended operations, his professional standing was indistinguishable from that of anyone else standing in the same bank queue. The status had operated through institutional infrastructure. When the infrastructure froze, the status froze with it. Hernando de Soto's research on the informal economy documents this pattern with forensic precision across dozens of developing world economies. He argues that the fundamental difference between formal and informal economic actors is not productivity, not intelligence, not even capital. It is access to institutional recognition, the formal titles, the credit histories, the legal identities that allow wealth to be recognized and leveraged within the institutional system. When the institutional system withdraws, the formal actors lose their institutional advantage. The informal actors who had never possessed it are not additionally disadvantaged by its disappearance. The implication is uncomfortable. The social status and institutional rank that the formal economy's most successful participants have spent. Careers accumulating is not a store of value. It is an access mechanism to a system. When the system is functioning, the access mechanism is enormously valuable. When the system stops functioning, it is worth exactly what it is in the absence of the system, which is nothing. New York, September 2008. In the weeks before Lehman Brothers collapsed, the most sophisticated financial institution in the world held a balance sheet of extraordinary complexity: collateralized debt obligations, structured investment vehicles, credit default swaps referencing other credit default swaps, tranched mortgage securities whose underlying composition was documented in prospectuses running to hundreds of pages, that almost nobody had read completely. The complexity was not accidental. It was the product, the financial engineering that had transformed pools of ordinary mortgages into instruments carrying AAA credit ratings was among the most intellectually sophisticated work being done anywhere in the global economy. The mathematicians and physicists who had designed these instruments had genuinely solved difficult problems in probability theory and financial modeling. The instruments they created were also, under any serious stress scenario, worthless. Not because the mathematics was wrong, because the mathematics was right, and the mathematics had been applied to a set of assumptions about housing prices, default correlations, and liquidity that were themselves wrong. But here is what the 2008 collapse revealed that goes deeper than the specific failure of mortgage modeling. It revealed something structural about complex financial instruments that holds across every collapse in which they have been present. Complexity is not a feature, it is a liability. In stable conditions, financial complexity generates value by creating instruments that match specific risk preferences, that allow precise allocation of capital to specific opportunities, that enable sophisticated hedging strategies. The complexity earns its premium because it does things that simple instruments cannot do. In collapsing conditions, financial complexity destroys value by creating instruments that cannot be priced, cannot be sold, cannot be unwound, and cannot be understood by anyone who needs to make a decision about them under time pressure. The CDO that was worth 97 cents on the dollar in 2006 was not worth 90 cents in 2008, or 80 cents, or 70. It was worth whatever someone would pay for it that day, and in the absence of any functioning price discovery mechanism, in the absence of any buyer willing to absorb the uncertainty of what was actually inside it, it was worth nothing functional. Not because its cash flows had gone to zero, because the institutional infrastructure that had assigned it a price, the rating agencies, the mark-to-market accounting systems, the interbank funding markets, had stopped producing reliable signals. The complexity that made it valuable in a functioning system made it unsaleable in a non-functioning one. Gary Gorton's research on the 2008 financial crisis identifies what he calls the informationally insensitive nature of complex financial instruments. In normal times, they function precisely because nobody looks too closely at what is inside them, because the institutional infrastructure provides sufficient assurance that close examination is unnecessary. When confidence in that infrastructure collapses, the instruments become informationally sensitive. Everyone suddenly needs to know exactly what is inside every instrument, and the complexity that made them efficient in normal times makes that examination impossible under crisis conditions. The instrument does not decline in value. It becomes unvalued not because it is worthless, but because nobody can establish what it is worth under the new conditions. The pattern predates 2008 by centuries. The financial crisis of 1772, the first truly international banking crisis in history, was precipitated by the collapse of complex credit instruments that had been built on chains of credit guarantees so convoluted that when one link in the chain failed, nobody could determine which other instruments were affected or by how much. The complexity was the infection vector. Every institution that held complex instruments became potentially contaminated, regardless of whether the specific instruments they held were actually affected. The response: selling everything complex, holding only the most simple and transparent. Instruments destroyed value in instruments that would eventually have proven sound. Because in a crisis, complexity is indistinguishable from contamination. This is the permanent condition of complex financial instruments in collapse. Their value is not a function of their underlying cash flows. It is a function of the institutional infrastructure that can evaluate those cash flows. When that infrastructure fails, complexity becomes a liability that exceeds any premium the complexity had earned in stable conditions. Detroit, 1960, the most valuable commercial real estate in Pointe. The American Midwest was located along Woodward Avenue in downtown Detroit. Flagship department stores, major office buildings, entertainment venues, financial headquarters. The property values reflected the reality that this was among the highest foot traffic, highest commerce, highest demand commercial corridors in the United States. By 1980, much of that same real estate had values approaching zero. Buildings that had sold for millions were being abandoned, the cost of maintaining them exceeding any rent that could be charged in a market that had disappeared. The I-2 land hadn't changed. The buildings were still standing. What had changed was the economic ecosystem that had made their location valuable. The foot traffic had migrated to suburbs. The commercial tenants had followed. The financial institutions had relocated. The entire network of economic activity that had been concentrated at those locations had dispersed, and the concentration had been the value. Detroit is the extreme American case. It is not the exceptional case. It is the pattern that plays out, with varying severity, in every economic collapse where the geography of economic activity reorganizes itself. The fundamental error in location-dependent wealth is treating location as an intrinsic property of a physical asset when it is actually a property of the economic ecosystem that surrounds the asset. The Viennese commercial property was not valuable because of what it was. It was valuable because of where it was, and where it was meant something only, as long as Vienna's commercial ecosystem continued to generate the activity that made that location desirable. When the ecosystem reorganized through war, through economic collapse, through the migration of economic activity, the location's value reorganized with it. Hernando de Soto's fieldwork across Latin America, Africa, and Asia documents this pattern with extraordinary consistency. Communities that appear to hold significant real estate wealth, families living on land they have occupied for generations, with strong community recognition of their ownership, discover during economic or political crises that their wealth is not transferable to the new institutional order. The land is real, the location is real, the community recognition of ownership is real, but none of these properties function as economic assets unless an institutional system is willing to recognize, record, and enforce the ownership claim. When that institutional system changes, when a new government imposes different property registration requirements, when economic collapse disrupts the legal system that enforces contracts, when political reorganization creates new rules for what constitutes legitimate ownership, the location-dependent wealth that appeared solid becomes contested, diminished, or worthless. The 2001 Argentine crisis produced this pattern in a purely financial form. Commercial real estate in Buenos Aires's central business district lost not only value but economic function. The businesses that had made those locations worth occupying had closed, relocated, or reorganized into the informal economy in ways that no longer required formal commercial space. The buildings remained. The ecosystem that had made them valuable had reorganized around different forms and different locations. The building is not the asset. The ecosystem is the asset. And ecosystems are far more fragile than buildings. Beirut, November 2019. Lebanon's banking system had, for decades, been one of the most sophisticated in the Middle East. Lebanese banks offered dollar-denominated accounts, competitive interest rates, and the credibility of institutions that had survived the country's civil war largely intact. The Lebanese banking sector's reputation for stability was itself an asset, attracting deposits from the Lebanese diaspora worldwide, functioning as a regional financial hub. Within weeks of the crisis beginning in October 2019, that reputation, accumulated over decades, had become actively harmful. The trust that depositors had placed in Lebanese banks was not simply disappointed. It was weaponized against them. The very relationships of trust that had led depositors to place their savings in Lebanese banks rather than in foreign accounts, in physical assets, in alternative stores of value, became the mechanism through which those savings were trapped when the banks imposed informal capital controls. The institutional trust capital that depositors had accumulated, the long relationships with specific banks, the credit histories, the banking identities meant nothing when the banks closed their doors to withdrawals. The trust had been the mechanism for concentrating savings in a system that would later prevent those savings from being accessed. This is the most counterintuitive form of value destruction that economic collapse produces. The institutional trust Capital, the credit score, the banking relationship, the formal financial identity is not merely worthless during a collapse. It is negative. It represents a prior decision to concentrate wealth within an institutional system that is now failing. The person who had distributed their wealth across multiple jurisdictions, multiple asset classes, multiple institutional relationships had less concentrated exposure when any single institution failed. The person who had maximized their institutional trust capital, placing maximum savings in the bank with the best relationship, building the highest credit score by concentrating borrowing with a single institution, had maximized their exposure to exactly the failure that the collapse produced. The World Bank's documentation of the Lebanese crisis shows this with painful specificity. The depositors who lost the most were disproportionately those who had been the most institutionally trusting, who had kept the highest proportions of their savings in Lebanese banks, who had maintained the longest and most consolidated banking relationships. Their institutional trust capital had functioned as a concentration mechanism in stable times. In crisis, the concentration was the vulnerability. The credit score is the domestic version of this principle. A high credit score represents a history of reliable institutional engagement of borrowing, repaying, maintaining relationships with institutional lenders over time. In stable conditions, the credit score is enormously valuable. It unlocks access to capital at favorable rates, signals creditworthiness across institutional relationships, functions as a form of financial identity. In a credit freeze, the credit score is irrelevant. The institutional infrastructure that evaluates credit scores, that uses them to make lending decisions, that maintains the databases in which they are recorded, when that infrastructure stops functioning, the score it produces becomes meaningless noise. The depositor with a perfect credit score standing outside a frozen Lebanese bank is indistinguishable in their practical capacity to access their savings from the depositor with no credit history. The trust capital they spent years building retained no value in the environment that had replaced the one they built it for. Moscow, 1992. Dr. Alexei Voronov. The name is composite. The story is documented across multiple sources. Had spent 22 years as a specialist in Soviet military procurement logistics. He understood with extraordinary depth and precision the specific bureaucratic architecture of how the Soviet defense establishment moved equipment from manufacturer to field deployment across 11 time zones. His knowledge was genuine. It was deep. It was the product of 2 decades of serious professional engagement with an enormously complex system. It was also, by January 1992, completely worthless. Not because procurement logistics had ceased to matter, not because the knowledge of how to move large quantities of equipment across vast distances had lost its relevance to human civilization, but because the specific institutional system within which his knowledge operated, the Soviet defense procurement apparatus with its specific procedures, its specific hierarchies, its specific bureaucratic architecture, had ceased to exist. His knowledge was not transferable to the new environment because it was not knowledge about procurement logistics in any general sense. It was knowledge about Soviet procurement logistics specifically. The specificity was what had made it valuable within the system. The specificity was what made it worthless when the system ended. This is the 5th and most psychologically devastating form of value destruction that economic collapse produces. Because unlike the other 4 assets we have examined, specialized institutional knowledge feels like something you own absolutely. It lives in your head. Nobody can take it from you. No crash can physically destroy it. And yet economic collapse destroys it as completely as any physical asset. The mechanism is precise. Specialized knowledge generates value not in isolation but in transaction. The procurement specialist's knowledge is valuable because someone will pay to access it, because Within the Soviet system, there are organizations that need what he knows and are willing to compensate him for knowing it. The knowledge generates value through its exchange within an institutional environment that creates demand for it. When the institutional environment is restructured, the demand for the specific knowledge restructures with it. The knowledge remains. The institutional context that converted it into economic value has been removed. The 2008 financial crisis produced the contemporary version of this pattern with extraordinary clarity. The quantitative analysts, the quants, who had built careers around specific mathematical models for pricing complex financial instruments, found their highly specialized knowledge losing its exchange value almost overnight. Not because the mathematics was wrong, because the instruments their mathematics was designed to price had lost their market. The CDO pricing models, the mortgage security valuation frameworks, the complex hedging strategies, all of it was knowledge that required a functioning, complex financial market to have economic value. When that market contracted dramatically, the demand for the knowledge contracted with it. Specialists who had commanded extraordinary compensation found themselves competing for a fraction of the positions that had previously existed, in a market that no longer needed what they specifically knew. The knowledge had not changed. The institutional context that had made it valuable had contracted. The value contracted with it. Jaroslav Hašek's observation about the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy, that it had created an entire civilization of specialists in things that existed nowhere else, applies to every highly specialized professional class. In every complex institutional system, the specialization is the point in stable conditions. The specialization is the vulnerability and collapse. There is a principle connecting all five of these assets, and it is a principle that conventional financial advice is structurally prevented from communicating. Every asset that loses all value in an economic crash loses it through the same mechanism. It loses the institutional infrastructure that converted it from a thing into a store of value. Social status is not a thing. It is an institutional recognition of a thing. When the institution stops recognizing it, it stops being valuable. Complex financial instruments are not things. They are institutional agreements about the value of things. When the agreement system stops functioning, the instruments lose their assigned value. Location-dependent wealth is not a property of land. It is a property of the economic ecosystem that surrounds land. When the ecosystem reorganizes, the location value reorganizes with it. Institutional trust capital is not savings. It is a record of institutional engagement. When the institutions stop honoring that record, the engagement becomes concentration risk rather than an asset. Specialized institutional knowledge is not capability. It is capability contextualized within a specific institutional demand. When the demand restructures, the capability loses its exchange value. In every case, what is destroyed is not the underlying thing. What is destroyed is the institutional layer that converted the thing into an economic asset. This distinction matters enormously for how you think about protecting wealth, because it means that the question is not which assets are safe. The question is, which of my assets retain their function when the institutional layer that currently assigns them value stops functioning? The Roman families who survived the denarius collapse were not those who held the most assets in absolute terms. They were those whose assets did not require the Roman institutional system to function. Their land produced food, regardless of which coins circulated. Their skills generated exchange value, regardless of which court enforced contracts. Their networks operated regardless of which emperor sat on the throne. The Argentine families who retained economic function through the 2001 crisis were not those with the highest credit scores or the largest deposits in the most respected banks. They were those whose wealth was least concentrated in institutional claims, who held assets that the crisis's specific failure mode could not reach. The Lebanese families who escaped the 2019 banking crisis with their savings intact were overwhelmingly those who had made the decision, often criticized as eccentric or paranoid at the time, to hold assets outside the Lebanese banking system. Not because they predicted the specific crisis, because they understood at some level that institutional trust capital is a concentration mechanism, not a diversification mechanism. Every economic collapse in the historical record is, at its core, a failure of institutional infrastructure. The infrastructure fails. The assets that depended on it fail with it. The assets that did not depend on it survive. This is not pessimism. It is the most important distinction in wealth management, one that stable conditions make invisible and collapse makes undeniable. The 5 assets we have examined are not bad investments in normal times. In normal times, they are excellent investments. Social status earns returns. Complex instruments generate alpha. Commercial real estate in prime locations appreciates. Institutional trust capital unlocks favorable credit. Specialized knowledge commands premium compensation. They fail simultaneously and completely because they all fail through the same mechanism, the withdrawal of the institutional layer that made them valuable. The Viennese professor lost everything because he had maximized his position in assets that all required the same institutional environment to function. When that environment changed, there was no asset in his portfolio that remained. He had not been reckless. He had not been ignorant. He had been optimizing for the world as it was, rather than building a position that could survive the world changing. That distinction between optimizing for the current institutional environment and building a position that survives its replacement is the distinction that economic collapse makes permanent and irrefutable. Rome did not warn its citizens that the denarius would be debased. Vienna did not warn its professionals that their institutional credentials would be invalidated. Beirut did not warn its depositors that their banking relationships would become traps rather than assets. The warning was always in the historical record, in the pattern that every collapse produces, in the consistent, documented, thoroughly researched finding that the assets most confidently held in the period before collapse are disproportionately the assets that lose all value when collapse arrives. History has been issuing this warning continuously for 2,000 years. The only question it keeps asking is the same one it has always asked. Are you building wealth that requires the current system to function? Or wealth that functions when the system doesn't? Subscribe. This channel performs economic autopsies on history's greatest collapses. The 5 assets that look safest before every crash are the 5 assets that fail first. History has documented this pattern in blood and broken institutional promises. We show you where to look.